Have you ever watched someone destroy their own future? Because they were absolutely certain the person standing beside them could never fight back? What if your own husband looked you in the eyes, laughed in front of your coworkers, and confidently told everyone, "She's nobody"? Would you expose him immediately? Or would you let him keep believing he was untouchable? My name is Sarah Bennett. For 7 years, I believed love was built on trust. Not money. Not titles. Not status. Just trust. That's why I never corrected people when they underestimated me. I never cared who received the credit. I never cared if people thought I was just another employee. As long as I went home each evening to a husband who respected me, nothing else mattered. At least, that's what I believed. Until one Tuesday afternoon, when the entire company gathered for what was supposed to be an ordinary quarterly meeting. I remember standing near the back of the room, holding my notebook, listening to people chatting while they waited for the meeting to begin. Then someone asked my husband where I was. He looked across the room, saw me standing there, smiled, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Don't worry about her. She's nobody." The room filled with quiet laughter. Some people looked away. Others pretended they hadn't heard. I simply stood there, said nothing. Because sometimes, the worst mistake a person can make is believing they've already won. That afternoon, my husband believed he had humiliated me in front of the entire company. He had no idea. The meeting hadn't even started. And neither had the worst day of his life. There are moments in life when a single sentence changes everything. Not because it's shouted. Not because it's cruel. But because the person saying it is someone you once believed would never intentionally hurt you. For me, that sentence was only 2 words long. She's nobody. 7 years before that afternoon, I married Daniel Bennett. He wasn't rich. Neither was I. We met at a charity fundraiser our company sponsored every Christmas. He was funny, confident, the kind of man who could make strangers feel like old friends within 5 minutes. When he proposed, he told me something I'd never forgotten. "I don't care what we have, as long as we're building it together." Back then, I believed every word. People often ask why I kept my personal life so separate from work. The answer is simple. Because work had never been about status to me. It was about purpose. Every morning, I arrived before most employees. I carried my own coffee, answered my own emails, ate lunch in the same cafeteria as everyone else. I never expected special treatment. In fact, I avoided it whenever I could. Daniel used to tease me about it. "You work harder than people trying to get promoted." I'd laugh. "And you complain more than people who actually deserve one." Those little conversations used to make us both smile. For years, our marriage felt ordinary, comfortable, safe. We weren't one of those couples who posted perfect pictures online. We argued about groceries, forgot anniversaries, watched old movies on Friday nights. Life wasn't exciting, but it was ours. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. Looking back now, the first warning signs were so small that I almost feel embarrassed I missed them. Daniel stopped introducing me as his wife during company events. Instead, he'd simply say, "This is Sarah." When people congratulated me for solving difficult problems at work, he'd immediately joke, "Don't let her fool you. She gets lucky more often than she's smart." Everyone laughed, including me. Because that's what wives do when they don't want to embarrass their husbands. We laugh, even when something hurts. Over time, The jokes became sharper. If I corrected him during conversations, he'd smile and say, "Relax, Sarah. You don't understand how these decisions are made." If I suggested an idea during meetings, he'd interrupt before I'd finished speaking. "I've already explained that." Even when he hadn't. Little things. Tiny moments. Easy to dismiss. Until they weren't. One evening, about 6 months before everything fell apart, we attended the company's annual dinner. Daniel spent nearly the entire evening talking with senior managers. I stayed with several employees from accounting. Halfway through dinner, one of the new assistants smiled at me. "I wish I had your confidence." I laughed. "What confidence?" "The way you never seem nervous around executives." Before I could answer, Daniel walked over. He wrapped an arm around my shoulder and smiled. "That's because Sarah knows nobody notices her anyway." Everyone laughed politely. The assistant looked uncomfortable. I smiled, changed the subject, and pretended I hadn't just been humiliated by my own husband. On the drive home, he acted as though nothing had happened. So did I. Sometimes, silence feels easier than confrontation. Until silence becomes permission. By the beginning of our 7th year of marriage, Daniel had changed. Or maybe success had simply revealed who he'd always been. He'd recently been promoted to Regional Operations Manager. It wasn't the highest position in the company, but it came with a larger office, a better salary, and something far more dangerous: an ego. He started talking differently, walking differently, even treating people differently. Receptionists became invisible. Junior employees became obstacles. Anyone who couldn't help his career stopped existing. I watched it happen slowly, like rust spreading beneath fresh paint. The man I'd married was still there. Sometimes, but not often enough. The Tuesday everything changed began like every other workday. Daniel left the house without waiting for me. That wasn't unusual anymore. I drove separately. Arrived just before 8. The office felt strangely busy. People whispered in hallways. Department heads hurried between meetings. By mid-morning, an email appeared in everyone's inbox. Mandatory company meeting. 2 p.m. Attendance required. Nobody knew why. Rumors spread immediately. New expansion. Leadership changes. Quarterly bonuses. Someone even joked that we'd finally get decent coffee in the break room. For the first time in weeks, the office actually felt excited. Around 1:30. Employees began gathering outside the main conference hall. Daniel stood near several department managers, laughing, telling stories, enjoying the attention. I quietly found a place near the back of the room. Just like I always did. I preferred listening over talking. A few minutes later, one of Daniel's colleagues looked around. "Where's your wife?" Daniel glanced toward me. Our eyes met for only a second. Then, he smiled. The same confident smile I'd fallen in love with years earlier. Only this time, it belonged to someone else. He laughed loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Don't worry about her." A few people chuckled. Then he added, even louder, "She's nobody." The laughter grew. Not cruel. Not vicious. Just enough. Enough for people to avoid looking at me. Enough for someone near the front to whisper, "That's harsh." Enough for me to realize my husband no longer cared whether he embarrassed me. I stood perfectly still. No anger. No tears. No argument. because something inside me had suddenly become very quiet. The room settled as everyone turned toward the stage. The meeting was about to begin. Daniel straightened his tie. Still smiling. Completely unaware that within the next few minutes, someone was about to walk into that room and change both of our lives forever. There is a strange kind of confidence that comes from believing you're the most important person in the room. It makes you speak louder, laugh harder, look down on people who don't seem important. Daniel had reached that point months ago. The problem was, he had become so busy deciding who mattered that he'd completely stopped noticing the people who actually did. The conference room slowly filled until every seat was occupied. Department managers sat near the front. Supervisors gathered together. The newer employees stood quietly along the walls. I stayed where I always stayed. Near the back. Not hidden. Simply unnoticed. Exactly the way I preferred it. At least. Until that afternoon. Daniel didn't look at me again. Why would he? As far as he was concerned, the moment had already passed. He'd made his joke. Everyone had laughed. The story was over. He had no idea. For me, it had only just begun. A voice came over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin in just a few moments. Conversations slowly faded. People straightened their jackets. Phones disappeared into pockets. Everyone expected another routine quarterly presentation. Sales figures. Growth projections. Future expansion. The usual. Nobody expected anything different. Neither did I. Just then, Rachel from Human Resources hurried toward the entrance. She looked unusually nervous. She whispered something to Daniel. He smiled confidently. I've got it. Rachel hesitated. Are you sure? He nodded. Relax. I've handled bigger meetings than this. She forced a smile and walked away. I noticed something strange. Rachel wasn't relieved. She looked worried. Daniel stepped onto the small stage. Without being asked. Without introducing anyone. He picked up the wireless microphone. Looks like we're still waiting. A few people laughed. So while we're buying time, let's make this meeting a little less boring. More laughter. He loved attention. Always had. He began joking about different departments. Sales. Accounting. Operations. Nothing particularly offensive. Just harmless office humor. People relaxed. The room became louder. Then, someone near the front jokingly asked, "So who's the hardest worker around here?" Daniel laughed. "Oh, that's easy." He pointed toward one of the warehouse supervisors. "That guy." Applause. Another voice shouted, "What about the smartest?" Daniel named someone from finance. More laughter. Then someone asked the question that changed everything. "What about your wife?" The room turned toward me. Daniel didn't hesitate. He smiled exactly the way he always smiled before making one of his harmless jokes. "My wife." He laughed. "She keeps the coffee machine busy." Scattered laughter. Then he shrugged. "Honestly, she mostly stays out of everyone's way." A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks. But nobody interrupted him. Confidence grows very quickly. When nobody challenges it, I lowered my eyes. Not because I felt ashamed. Because I suddenly understood something. Daniel wasn't trying to be funny anymore. He genuinely believed what he was saying. That realization hurt far more than the joke itself. Then the conference room doors opened. Not dramatically. Quietly. almost politely. The entire room turned. 3 people walked inside. A woman from corporate communications, the chief executive officer, and an elderly gentleman I had only met a handful of times over the years. Every conversation stopped immediately. The CEO rarely visited regional offices. When he did, something important was happening. Daniel immediately walked forward with his biggest smile. "Mr. Harrison. It's an honor." The CEO shook his hand. "Good afternoon, Daniel." Daniel began introducing department managers one by one. Confident, relaxed, completely in control. Then he gestured toward the room. "Everyone's here. We're ready whenever you are." The CEO glanced around the room, then quietly asked, "Is everyone here?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." The CEO looked past him. His eyes searched the room. Not the front rows. Not the managers. The back. Until they stopped. On me. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled warmly and started walking directly toward the last row. The room watched in complete silence. Daniel turned, confused, wondering who the CEO was greeting. He followed the CEO's line of sight, straight to me. For the first time all afternoon, the smile disappeared from Daniel's face. The CEO stopped beside me, extended his hand, and with genuine respect said, "Ms. Bennett, thank you for coming." Every head in the room turned toward me. The silence felt heavier than any words ever could. Daniel stared at us, trying to understand why the most powerful executive in the company was greeting his wife like she was the most important person in the room, and no one spoke. Not because they were confused. Because they were trying to understand something that didn't make sense. The CEO had walked past every department head, every senior manager, even Daniel, to greet the woman most people barely noticed. I shook his hand politely. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. It's good to see you again." Again. One simple word. But it landed like a stone in still water. Again? Several employees exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel blinked. He'd worked for the company for almost 12 years. As far as he knew, I'd never met the CEO. Not once. Mr. Harrison smiled. "I hope the drive wasn't too difficult. Traffic wasn't kind today." I smiled back. "It wasn't too bad." He nodded. "I'm glad you made it." There was nothing unusual about the conversation. At least, not on the surface. But people weren't listening to the words anymore. They were watching the respect, the tone, the familiarity, the way neither of us seemed nervous. Daniel quickly stepped closer, trying to regain control. He forced a laugh. "I didn't realize you two knew each other." Mr. Harrison looked at him. "We've met several times over the years." Daniel laughed again. "Oh. Well. I guess I learned something new today." His smile looked practiced now. Not natural. The CEO didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the audience. "Let's begin." Everyone took their seats. Daniel walked back to the front row. But he wasn't listening anymore. Every few seconds, he glanced over his shoulder toward me, trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly appeared in front of him. The presentation began. Quarterly performance, revenue, expansion plans, new contracts. It should have been routine. Normally Daniel loved meetings like this. He'd whisper comments, take notes, Volunteer answers. Today. He barely moved. His attention wasn't on the presentation. It was on me. About 20 minutes later. The CEO paused. There is one final item before we conclude. The room immediately became quiet. Mr. Harrison looked toward the woman from corporate communications. She handed him a slim black folder. He opened it slowly. This office has consistently exceeded expectations. Several managers smiled. Daniel sat a little straighter. He was certain recognition was coming. He'd led several successful projects that quarter. This, surely, was his moment. We've decided, the CEO continued, to move forward with a major restructuring of regional leadership. People looked at one another. Some excited. Others nervous. Daniel adjusted his jacket. His confidence returned. He was already imagining a larger office. A new title. Another promotion. Then the CEO said something unexpected. Before any announcements are made, there is someone whose opinion matters greatly. The room waited. Daniel smiled. Probably a board representative. Or someone joining by video. Instead, the CEO closed the folder, looked toward the back of the room, and said calmly, "Sarah, would you join me for a moment?" Every eye turned toward me. For a second, nobody moved, including Daniel. I remained seated. "Is that really necessary?" I asked quietly. Mr. Harrison smiled. "I believe it is." His voice was respectful. Almost careful. Not the tone of a chief executive speaking to an employee. More like someone asking a favor. The room had become impossibly quiet. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and slowly walked toward the front. Every step felt heavier than the last. Not because I was nervous. Because I knew exactly what people were thinking. Why her? What is happening? Who is she? Daniel watched me approach the stage. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. When I reached the front, Mr. Harrison stepped slightly aside. Not much. Just enough for everyone to notice. It was a small gesture. But in business, small gestures often reveal the biggest truths. He handed me the black folder. "I think this belongs with you." I looked down at it, then back at him. "We discussed waiting." "I know," he answered softly. "But after what happened a few minutes ago, I don't think waiting serves anyone anymore." Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" Neither of us answered. Mr. Harrison faced the audience again. "I've had the privilege of leading this company for nearly 15 years. I'm proud of what we've built. But no company succeeds because of one person. It succeeds because of the values it's willing to protect." He paused. "And today, I'd like to introduce someone very few people in this room truly know." Daniel let out a nervous laugh. Almost as if he expected another executive to walk through the doors. Instead, the CEO slowly turned toward me. Then, without saying another word, he took one step back. The entire room watched in stunned silence. As the most powerful executive in the company, quietly gave me the center of the stage, the silence in the room felt almost unreal. More than 200 employees sat frozen in their chairs. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody whispered. Nobody even looked at the presentation screen anymore. Every pair of eyes was fixed on one question. Who was Sarah Bennett? I looked at the folder Mr. Harrison had placed in my hands. Then I looked back at him. "You've put me in a very difficult position." He gave a small nod. I know. I apologize. I had hoped this day would happen differently. Those words confused the room even more. The chief executive officer. Apologizing to me, Daniel's forehead tightened. He had spent years chasing opportunities to impress executives. Now the company's CEO was standing beside his wife, speaking as though he owed her an explanation. Nothing about it made sense. Mr. Harrison turned back toward the audience. I think many of you deserve an explanation. He paused. Especially after what was said a few minutes ago. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. His eyes immediately searched the room. People weren't looking at the CEO anymore. They were looking at him. Some remembered his jokes. Others remembered the laughter. For the first time, Daniel realized everyone else remembered it too. The CEO continued. 7 years ago, our founder, William Bennett, stepped away from daily operations after his health began to decline. Several longtime employees nodded. Everyone knew the name. William Bennett had built the company from a single warehouse into a national business. His photograph still hung in the lobby. Most newer employees had never met him. But everyone respected him. Mr. Harrison smiled gently. I had the privilege of working beside William for nearly 20 years. He taught me that leadership isn't measured by authority. It's measured by responsibility. I lowered my eyes. Hearing my father's name still wasn't easy. Even after all these years. When Mr. Bennett retired, the CEO continued. He made one request. He wanted the company protected. Not just financially, but culturally. He worried that someday, titles would become more important than character. The room remained perfectly still. No one interrupted. Daniel glanced toward me. Then back at the CEO. His expression had changed. The confidence was gone. Now, there was uncertainty. Mr. Harrison continued. He also made another decision. A deeply personal one. He transferred his ownership according to a succession plan that had been prepared years in advance. A few department heads exchanged curious looks. Ownership? Why were they discussing ownership? This was supposed to be a leadership meeting. The CEO looked toward me. I argued against part of that decision. I believed the new owner should immediately take a public leadership role. I gave a small smile. And I refused. A few quiet murmurs spread across the room. Mr. Harrison nodded. She did. She believed respect should be earned, not inherited. Daniel suddenly spoke. His voice sounded smaller than usual. I'm sorry. I'm not following. The CEO looked directly at him. I know. Because there was never any reason for you to know. Daniel swallowed. The room had become so quiet that someone dropping a pen would have sounded like thunder. Mr. Harrison slowly extended his hand toward me. Not introducing me as an executive. Not as a director. Simply allowing the truth to speak for itself. He said quietly. The woman you've known as a project coordinator. The woman who chose to work beside every department instead of above them. The woman your founder trusted more than anyone else. He paused. Then finished the sentence that changed the room forever. Is Sarah Bennett William Bennett's daughter? A ripple of surprise swept across the room. Several employees looked toward the framed portrait hanging near the entrance. Then back at me. The resemblance suddenly seemed obvious. How had they never noticed? Daniel didn't react. Not immediately. He simply stared. His mouth opened slightly. Closed again. He looked from me to the portrait. Then back to me. His face had gone completely pale, but the CEO wasn't finished. He took one slow breath. Then said the words Daniel never imagined he would hear. And under Mr. Bennett's succession plan, Sarah became the majority shareholder of this company 7 years ago. No one laughed. No one whispered. The room simply froze. Daniel looked at me. As if no one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. The words majority shareholder hung in the air like they belonged to someone else. Most of the employees had spent years trying to understand how this company worked. Now they were realizing they had never understood it at all. And Daniel looked like the floor had disappeared beneath him. He were seeing his own wife for the very first time. And in that moment, he finally understood that the woman he had just called nobody had been the one person in the room whose opinion could change his entire future. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. The words majority shareholder hung in the air like they belonged to someone else. Most of the employees had spent years trying to understand how this company worked. Now they were realizing they had never understood it at all. And Daniel looked like the floor had disappeared beneath him. He stared at me. Then at Mr. Harrison. Then back at me again. This. He swallowed hard. This has to be some kind of mistake. His voice was barely recognizable. You got the wrong Sarah. A few people lowered their heads. Others simply watched. Not because they wanted to see him embarrassed, but because they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. I looked at him calmly. There isn't another Sarah Bennett. The sentence wasn't angry. It wasn't sarcastic. It was simply true. And somehow, that made it hurt even more. Daniel shook his head. You never told me. For the first time that afternoon, there was pain in his voice. Real pain. Not fear. Not yet. Confusion. I answered quietly. You never asked. He blinked. What? You never once asked about my family. You never asked why my last name matched the founder's. You never asked why I refused promotions. You never asked why I was happy doing work that other people thought was beneath me. I paused. You simply decided you already knew who I was. The room was silent again. Several employees slowly looked toward Daniel. Not with satisfaction. With disappointment. Mr. Harrison stepped forward. I think everyone deserves to understand why Sarah chose this path. He looked around the room. 7 years ago, after Mr. Bennett passed away, Sarah inherited majority ownership. At the first board meeting, every advisor gave her the same recommendation. He smiled faintly. They told her to move into the executive floor. Take over the largest office. Replace senior leadership. Make it clear who was in charge. A few managers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The CEO continued. She refused every single suggestion. Someone from finance raised a hand. You mean you chose to work as a regular employee? I nodded. Yes. But why? It was the same question everyone was thinking. Including Daniel. I looked around the room. When I was growing up, my father used to walk through the warehouse every Friday. He knew the forklift drivers by name. He knew whose children were graduating. He knew who was caring for sick parents. He always told me, if the only people willing to speak honestly to you are executives, you'll eventually stop understanding the company you own. The room became perfectly still. So after he died, I decided to learn the business the same way he did. From the inside. Without people treating me differently. One of the warehouse supervisors spoke quietly. So, you've been working beside us all these years. Because you wanted to understand us? I smiled. I wanted to earn the right to make decisions that affected your lives. Several employees nodded. For many of them, things suddenly made sense. Why Sarah knew employees from every department. Why she visited warehouses. Why she regularly asked questions no executive ever asked. Why she listened more than she spoke. Daniel looked like he was trying to remember every conversation we'd ever had. Every evening I'd come home tired. Every weekend I'd talk about employees by name. Every time I'd defend someone he'd criticized. He was seeing our marriage differently now. Not because I'd changed. Because he finally understood the parts he'd never bothered to notice. Then his voice became almost a whisper. So, you could have told everyone who you were. At any time. Yes. And you didn't. No. Why? I held his eyes for several long seconds. Then answered honestly. Because I wanted one place in my life. Where people loved me. Without caring what I owned. The words landed harder than any accusation ever could. Daniel slowly lowered his head. Because he knew. Without anyone saying it. That somewhere along the way. He had stopped seeing me as his partner. He had started measuring people by status. By titles. By influence. And without realizing it, he had become exactly the kind of leader this company had been built to reject. Mr. Harrison finally broke the silence. There is one more reason today's meeting was called. Every head turned toward him. He picked up the black folder again. I wasn't here simply to introduce Sarah. He looked toward Daniel. Then toward every manager sitting in the front rows. The board has completed a 6-month leadership review. Several department heads immediately became tense. Leadership review? No one had mentioned that. Mr. Harrison opened the folder. This morning, the board voted unanimously on a series of leadership changes. Daniel's breathing visibly slowed. For just a brief second, hope returned to his face. Maybe everything that had happened was separate from his career. Maybe he could still recover. Mr. Harrison looked down at the first page. Then quietly said, "The first decision concerns Regional Operations Manager Daniel Bennett." The room fell silent once again. And this time, even Daniel looked afraid of what he was about to hear. When people imagine career-ending moments, they picture shouting, arguments, security escorts, public humiliation. The truth is usually much quieter. Sometimes, a career ends with nothing more than a few sentences read from a folder. Daniel remained standing. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him. Trying to appear composed. Trying to convince himself this was all a misunderstanding. Around the room, no one spoke. Even the employees who had laughed at his jokes earlier now avoided looking at him. The atmosphere had changed. Not because everyone suddenly knew who I was. Because everyone had started questioning the kind of leader Daniel had become. Mr. Harrison looked down at the first page. As part of the board's annual leadership review, we evaluate financial performance, operational results, employee retention, and leadership conduct. Daniel nodded slightly. Those were normal metrics. His department had produced excellent numbers. He had every reason to believe he would come out well. The CEO continued. Mr. Bennett, your division exceeded every financial target this year. Daniel let out a slow breath. Several managers nodded. That part was true. He had worked hard. No one could deny it. But, Mr. Harrison said quietly, our company has never measured leadership by results alone. The room became still again. We also evaluate how those results are achieved. He closed the folder for a moment. My predecessor taught me something I have never forgotten. A business can survive poor numbers. It rarely survives poor character. Daniel shifted uneasily. What exactly are you saying? The CEO answered without raising his voice. I'm saying this review did not begin today. It began 6 months ago. Daniel frowned. 6 months? Mr. Harrison nodded. After a noticeable increase in employee complaints. A murmur spread across the room. Complaints? No one had expected that. We received reports from multiple departments. Not about productivity. About culture. He looked around the room. Employees described meetings where junior staff were publicly dismissed. They described ideas being ridiculed before they could be explained. They described talented people requesting transfers simply to avoid working under certain managers. Several people slowly lowered their eyes. Daniel recognized some of them. They weren't strangers. They were members of his own team. I don't believe this, Daniel said. No one ever complained to me. One woman from finance quietly whispered. Because they were afraid to. The words weren't loud. But in the silence, everyone heard them. Daniel turned toward her. You never said anything. She met his eyes. We stopped believing it would matter. Mr. Harrison opened the folder again. We interviewed 38 employees. Across 5 departments. The same pattern appeared again. And again. And again. He looked directly at Daniel. Excellent manager. Poor leader. Daniel's face tightened. You're ending my career because people don't like me? No. The CEO answered immediately. We're questioning your leadership because too many people stopped trusting you. There's a difference. He continued reading. One employee wrote. The numbers matter more than the people. Another. Ideas are only welcome if they come from the right person. Another. Respect depends on your position, not your contribution. The room was silent. Those weren't dramatic accusations. That was what made them believable. Daniel looked around desperately. I built that department. I stayed late. I worked weekends. I sacrificed everything. I earned my promotion. No one is denying that. Mr. Harrison replied. But leadership isn't proven by the hours you work. It's proven by how people feel after they've worked with you. For the first time. Daniel looked at me. Not the CEO. Not the board. Me. His voice had become almost pleading. Sarah. You know I'm not like this. I didn't answer immediately. Because I wasn't thinking about today. I was remembering years of small moments. The interrupted conversations. The public jokes. The dismissive smiles. The evenings when he'd come home speaking about coworkers as though some people simply mattered less. Finally. I spoke. Quietly. I know you weren't always like this. The room remained perfectly still. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing people. You started seeing positions. And once that happened, you stopped hearing anyone who couldn't help your career. Daniel lowered his head. Because he knew. I wasn't talking only about the office. I was talking about our marriage. Mr. Harrison placed the folder on the table. The board voted unanimously. Effective immediately. Your responsibilities as Regional Operations Manager are suspended pending a formal review. A sharp breath echoed somewhere in the room. Daniel didn't move. He simply stared ahead. As though he hadn't understood the words. Then the CEO added something no one expected. This decision was made yesterday morning. He paused. It had nothing to do with what happened in this room today. Every employee looked surprised. Daniel slowly looked up. What? Mr. Harrison nodded. The investigation was already complete. Today's events changed nothing. He looked directly at Daniel. They only revealed why the board made the right decision. Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time that afternoon, he understood the truth. He hadn't lost his position because Sarah had revealed who she was. He had lost it long before the meeting ever began. He just hadn't known it yet. And the cruelest part of all was that no one else had taken it from him. He had destroyed it himself, and one left the conference room. The meeting had officially ended. But no one stood. No one reached for their bags. It was as though everyone understood. They had just witnessed something far bigger than a leadership announcement. They had watched a man discover that success could disappear long before a paycheck stopped. Daniel remained exactly where he was, staring at the folder lying on the conference table. For years, he had walked into meetings believing he controlled every conversation. Now, he couldn't think of a single word to say. One by one, employees quietly began leaving. Not because they wanted to avoid him. Because they didn't know how to face him. Some nodded respectfully toward me as they walked past. Others simply offered a small smile. There was no celebration. No applause. No satisfaction. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy that everyone had seen coming. Except the one person living it. Rachel from Human Resources approached Daniel first. "I'm sorry." She said it sincerely. Daniel looked at her. "Were you one of them?" She hesitated. "One of who?" "One of the people who complained." Rachel lowered her eyes. "I didn't file the complaint." She paused. "But I confirmed what others had experienced." Daniel stared at her. "You too?" Rachel nodded slowly. "I tried talking to you. More than once. You always said we could discuss it later. There was never a later." She quietly walked away. A warehouse supervisor stopped beside Daniel. His name was Carlos. He'd worked for the company nearly 20 years. Daniel looked up hopefully. "Carlos. You know I always supported your department." Carlos smiled sadly. "You supported our numbers." He placed a gentle hand on the back of a chair. "But you stopped supporting the people." Then he walked away. Those words seemed to hit Daniel harder than the suspension itself. Because they came from someone who had once respected him. Within a few minutes, the conference room had almost emptied. Only 4 people remained. Mr. Harrison, myself, Daniel, and the company secretary collecting documents. The room suddenly felt much larger than before. Daniel finally looked at me. "I need to ask you something." I nodded. "All right." His voice was quiet now. "So, when did everyone know?" "They didn't." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've never announced who I was. Outside the board. Very few people knew before today." He looked genuinely confused. "Then why did they suddenly look at me like—" He couldn't finish the sentence. I answered it for him. "Like they finally understood something." He slowly nodded. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Daniel. They weren't shocked because I own part of the company. They were shocked because they watched a husband speak to his wife in a way no one should." He looked down at the table. I continued. "If you'd said those words to any employee, it would have been wrong. The fact that you said them to your own wife made everyone wonder who you had become." Daniel covered his face with both hands. "I don't even know when I changed." "Neither did I." "Not exactly." There hadn't been one terrible day. One terrible decision. It had happened little by little. One promotion point, one compliment. One successful quarter. One person ignored. One joke at someone else's expense. Until arrogance stopped feeling like arrogance. And started feeling normal. After several moments, Daniel looked at me again. Why didn't you stop me? The question surprised me. What do you mean? You saw this happening. You knew I was changing. Why didn't you force me to see it? I smiled sadly. I tried. You remember the dinner 2 years ago? He looked confused. You joked that nobody noticed me. I told you it embarrassed me. You said. I paused. That I was taking things too personally. His eyes slowly widened. He remembered. And last winter. I continued. When I suggested you apologize to the analyst whose presentation you interrupted. You told me. Leadership isn't about making everyone happy. Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered that too. There were dozens of conversations like that. I wasn't silent. You just stopped listening. For the first time since the meeting began. Daniel started to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The kind of tears that come when excuses finally run out. I'm sorry. He whispered. I'm so sorry. The words echoed through the nearly empty room. Years ago. Hearing those words would have meant everything to me. Today. They felt painfully late before I could answer. Mr. Harrison walked back toward us. He wasn't carrying another folder. Only a single envelope. He placed it gently on the table in front of Daniel. Daniel looked at it. What's this? The CEO answered calmly. It's from the board. Daniel's face turned pale again. Another decision? Mr. Harrison shook his head. No. It's something Sarah requested. Daniel looked at me. Confused. You? I nodded. Yes. He slowly picked up the envelope. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside. There was only one sheet of paper. He unfolded it. Read the first line. Then looked up at me in complete disbelief. Because instead of approving the board's recommendation, I had written something that no one in that room expected. Daniel stared at the letter. Then back at me. Then at the letter again. I don't understand. His voice had almost disappeared. Mr. Harrison quietly stepped back. This isn't from the board. It's from Sarah. I simply agreed to deliver it. The room was almost empty now. Only the four of us remained. And somehow, the silence felt even heavier than it had during the meeting. Daniel unfolded the paper completely. At the top, there was only one sentence. Recommendation regarding Daniel Bennett. He swallowed. Then continued reading. His lips moved silently. Halfway down the page, his eyes suddenly stopped. He looked up at me. Confused. You recommended that they don't terminate me? I nodded. Yes. His face filled with disbelief. Why? It wasn't an angry question. It was an honest one. He truly couldn't understand. Mr. Harrison spoke before I could answer. The board voted to end your employment. Daniel's shoulders dropped. I asked them to wait. Daniel slowly turned toward me again. You stopped them? Temporarily. The word mattered. I wanted him to understand that. Nothing had been erased. Nothing had been forgiven. Only paused. Daniel looked back at the letter. I don't deserve this. No. I answered honestly. Not today. The truth hurt. But pretending otherwise wouldn't help either of us. He lowered the paper. Then why? I took a slow breath. Because my father believed something that I spent years trying to live by. I looked toward the portrait still hanging outside the conference room. He used to say, if people are never allowed to learn from their worst mistake, then leadership becomes nothing more than punishment. Daniel listened without interrupting. He also believed something else. Character isn't measured by whether you fail. It's measured by what you do after failure. Daniel stared at the floor. I've already failed. Yes. You humiliated your wife. You damaged your team's trust. You ignored people who tried to help you. I paused. And now? You have one opportunity. His eyes slowly met mine. To decide who you're going to become. Mr. Harrison opened another page from the folder. The board accepted Sarah's request. Daniel looked surprised. They did? They agreed to suspend the termination. Instead, you've been placed on unpaid administrative leave for 90 days. Daniel blinked. 90 days? The CEO nodded. During that time, you'll participate in executive leadership coaching. You'll meet individually with employees who volunteered to speak. You'll complete every recommendation made during the culture review. And after 90 days, the board will decide whether you've earned another opportunity. Daniel remained silent. Not because he disliked the decision. Because he had expected far worse. Mr. Harrison looked directly at him. Don't misunderstand what this means. This isn't mercy. It's responsibility. You won't return because Sarah is your wife. You'll return only if the people you've hurt believe you've changed. Daniel slowly nodded. I understand. For several long moments, no one spoke. Then Daniel folded the letter carefully. Almost respectfully. I spent months believing promotions made me successful. He laughed quietly. There wasn't any joy in it. I never realized I'd already become a failure. I looked at him. You weren't a failure. You became someone who stopped listening. Those aren't always the same thing. He looked surprised. You still believe I can change? I thought about the question carefully. Then answered truthfully. I believe people can change. I don't know if they always choose to. Daniel wiped his eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't ask. I just. He stopped. Searching for the right words. I wish I'd listened sooner. I smiled sadly. So do I. Mr. Harrison quietly closed the folder. I'll leave the two of you alone. He and the secretary walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he stopped. Without turning around, he said, Sarah. Your father would have been proud of the decision you made today. The door closed. The room became completely silent. Daniel sat across from me, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Not because he'd lost his position. Because, for the first time in years, he had stopped pretending to be bigger than everyone else. After a long silence, he finally whispered, "Can I ask you one last question?" I nodded. He looked directly into my eyes, his voice barely audible. "Were you already planning to leave me? Before today's meeting?" For a moment, I didn't answer. Not because I hadn't heard the question. Because I'd asked myself the same thing more times than I could count. Had I already given up on my marriage? Before Daniel stood in front of 200 people and called me nobody? The honest answer was painful. I looked at him quietly. I wasn't planning to leave. You refused to let me help slightly. When I asked why, I continued. You smiled but and I was said, beginning to wonder if we're building a life together. Whether the man I married had already left me. I'll never make you feel like you're carrying it alone. The hope that had briefly appeared in his eyes. I smiled sadly. Disappeared. You kept that promise for a long time. You know what hurt the most today? Then somewhere, I asked. You stopped treating me like your partner. It wasn't the laughter. And started treating me like someone standing in your way. It wasn't even those 2 words. Daniel looked at me carefully. I don't deserve another chance. I took a slow breath. I replied honestly, when you looked across that room, you don't deserve one. You didn't see your wife. He looked up. You saw someone you believed had no value. I continued. And that means? Second chances aren't earned. It didn't happen by accident. They're given. It happened because the question isn't whether you deserve one. Daniel lowered his head. He couldn't deny it. What will you do with it? I kept replaying one moment before everyone else was talking. I don't expect you to come into our first apartment. I'm not. He looked up. I don't expect you to forgive me. You remember what you said? I don't expect anything. I think so. His voice broke. You carried every single box. I just wanted you to know. I finally understand what I destroyed. I stood. Picked up my notebook. The same notebook I'd carried into hundreds of ordinary meetings over the years. Funny how ordinary objects become part of unforgettable days. I looked at Daniel one last time. I hope you become the leader you used to believe you were. Then I paused. And I hope one day you become the husband I believed you already were. Those words hurt both of us. Because they were true. I walked toward the door. Before opening it, I stopped. Without turning around, I said, "My father once told me something after his biggest business failure. He said, never let success convince you that you're better than people. And never let failure convince you that you can't become better." I've carried those words my entire life. I hope you will too. Then, I left. 3 months later. The board met again. This time, there was no audience. No speeches. No dramatic announcements. Only reports. Interviews. And recommendations. Daniel had completed every requirement. He apologized personally to every employee who agreed to meet with him. Not with excuses. Not with explanations. With accountability. Several employees remained skeptical. A few never accepted his apology. And honestly, they had every right not to. Trust doesn't return because someone says I'm sorry. It returns only when actions become consistent. The board voted to reinstate Daniel. Not as regional operations manager. That position had already been filled. Instead, he returned as a senior operations supervisor. A role with less authority, less prestige, and far more accountability. Some people thought it was a demotion. Daniel called it something else. A chance I didn't deserve. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing titles. He was trying to earn respect. As for us, people always ask whether we stayed married. The answer isn't as simple as yes or no. We didn't move back in together immediately. We spent months in counseling. Long conversations. Painful conversations. Honest conversations. Some ended in silence. Some ended in tears. Healing isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. It's choosing. Again and again. To tell the truth, to listen, and to change. A year later. We renewed our vows. Not because our marriage had been perfect, but because we finally understood that love isn't protected by promises made on a wedding day. It's protected by the respect you show each ordinary Tuesday, when no one else is watching. Today, when I walk through our offices, most new employees still don't know who I am. That's intentional. I still eat in the cafeteria. I still visit every department. I still ask more questions than I answer. Because ownership has never been the most important thing about leadership. Character is. And every time I pass the conference room where Daniel once stood, I remember the afternoon my husband loudly declared, "She's nobody." He thought those words made him look powerful. Instead, they revealed exactly how small he'd become. If this story reminds you of someone in your own life, or maybe even reminds you of yourself, remember this. The easiest way to discover someone's true character isn't to watch how they treat people who can help them. It's to watch how they treat the people they believe have nothing to offer. Because titles can be taken away. Money can disappear. Power can change hands overnight. But respect, once it's lost, takes far longer to earn back than most people ever imagine. And sometimes, the person you underestimate today is the one whose opinion will matter most tomorrow. 2 years have passed since that meeting. The conference room looks exactly the same. Same walls. Same projector. Same long table. But every time I walk inside, I remember the silence that followed 2 simple words. She's nobody. Ironically, that room became the place where our company changed the most. Not because of me. Because of what everyone learned that day. Daniel kept his promise. He never asked for another promotion. He never mentioned his old title. Instead, he arrived early. Stayed late. Listened more than he spoke. If a junior employee had an idea, he let them finish. If someone made a mistake, he coached instead of criticized. At first, people thought he was pretending. Trust isn't rebuilt with speeches. It's rebuilt through consistency. Week after week. Month after month. Eventually, people stopped talking about who he used to be and started noticing who he had become. Last month, a young supervisor knocked on my office door. "I wanted to thank you." I smiled. "For what?" she said. "When I first became a manager, I was terrified. Then Daniel spent 3 hours helping me prepare for my first team meeting. He told me something I'll never forget." I asked, "What did he say?" She smiled. "He said, never make someone feel small just to make yourself feel important." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Because I knew exactly where he'd learned that lesson. Sometimes people still ask why I never moved into the executive office. The answer hasn't changed. Leadership doesn't happen behind the biggest desk. It happens in hallways. In warehouses. In lunchrooms. In ordinary conversations. That's where you discover what people are really thinking. And that's where respect is earned. A few weeks ago, someone new joined the company. During lunch, he pointed toward me and quietly asked Daniel, "Who's that lady?" Daniel looked across the cafeteria, smiled, and answered with words I'll remember for the rest of my life. "That's the woman who taught me the difference." between having authority and earning respect. He didn't mention that I was his wife. He didn't mention ownership. He didn't mention titles. He simply told the truth. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, I hope you remember one thing. The people we underestimate are often the people we never took the time to understand. Kindness is free. Respect costs nothing. But the moment you decide someone is nobody, you reveal far more about yourself than you ever will about them. Thank you for listening to my story.